The call came just after midnight. My phone buzzed against the polished metal of my desk, shattering the stillness of the morgue. I glanced at the caller ID, Detective Sean Marshall. We'd worked together before, usually on cases that seemed impossible to crack. If he was calling me now, it wasn't for a routine case. "Dr. Graves speaking," I answered, my voice steady but low, mindful of the oppressive quiet that always blanketed this place at night.
"We've got a situation. Young woman mid to late 20s found dead in a wheat field just outside the city. No visible injuries, no signs of struggle."
"And you're calling me because—"
"Because it doesn't make sense. No cause of death, nothing. She's Emily Harrington."
The name hit me like a punch to the chest. Emily Harrington, daughter of Senator Richard Harrington. A face I'd seen in the papers and on television. A young woman with a radiant smile, now lifeless, in a field miles from her city life. "I'll take the case," I said without hesitation, already reaching for my coat. The drive home that night was slow, the kind of crawl through the city streets that gave my mind room to wander. Emily's name brought back flashes of another woman who had once commanded the public's attention. My mother. I remember her best in the mornings, the sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows, catching in her dark hair as she moved with a sense of purpose that seemed unshakable. Margaret Graves wasn't just my mother, she was the mayor of our city, a force of nature who balanced authority with grace. But then one day, she was gone. I was only 9 when they told me she'd been found in her car on the outskirts of the city. An accident, they said, though no one could explain why a woman who loved life as much as she did would wind up dead in such a quiet, unremarkable place. My father tried his best to fill the void, but losing her broke him in ways I couldn't understand at the time. Her death became the cornerstone of my life, shaping me, driving me. By the time I graduated high school, I knew I'd dedicate my life to uncovering the truths that others couldn't or wouldn't see. Forensic pathology wasn't just a career, it was my way of ensuring no one else would ever feel the weight of unanswered questions like I had. By the time Emily's body arrived at the morgue the following evening, I was ready. The moment I unzipped the body bag, I was struck by how serene she looked, as though she were merely sleeping. Her skin was pale, her expression relaxed, almost content, but death rarely left clues on the surface. "All right, Emily," I murmured, slipping on a pair of gloves. "Let's see what you can tell me." Hours passed as I worked under the sterile glow of fluorescent lights. I combed through every inch of her body, tested for poisons, and checked for the faintest hint of foul play. But there was nothing. No bruises, no needle marks, no internal trauma. It was as though her body had simply stopped. Frustration prickled at the edges of my focus. People didn't just die without a reason, not healthy young women like Emily Harrington. I leaned back from the table, my eyes falling on her lifeless face. For a fleeting moment, it wasn't Emily I saw, but my mother. The same unanswered questions stared back at me, the same gnawing sense of injustice. I shook the thought away and forced myself to focus. I'd find the truth for Emily, just as I'd promised myself I would for every other soul that passed through my table. But as I prepared to document my findings, I felt it. A cold draft swept through the room, raising the hair on the back of my neck. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, but the morgue was empty. Empty, save for me and the dead. The chill lingered long after I convinced myself it was just a draft. Morgues weren't exactly known for their warmth, but this was different, sharp and invasive, like icy needles crawling across my skin. I turned back to the examination table, determined to shake the unease and focus. Emily Harrington's lifeless face stared back at me. The air in the room felt heavy, pressing down on me with the weight of unspoken words. I busied myself with the autopsy report, jotting down notes in a deliberate rhythm to drown out my rising anxiety. But then, faintly at first, I heard it. A whisper. I froze, my pen halting mid-stroke. The sound wasn't loud enough to make out words, but it was unmistakably human. "Hello?" My voice wavered, echoing off the sterile walls. The morgue was empty. It always was this time of night. The whisper came again, louder now, curling around me like smoke.
"Help me, please."
My heart pounded in my chest as I turned toward the source. That's when I saw her. Emily. She stood near the examination table, her figure pale and translucent, shimmering faintly in the dim light. Her eyes, hollow with desperation, locked onto mine. I stumbled back, my hands gripping the edge of the desk for support. "This isn't real," I whispered to myself, shaking my head. Emily stepped closer, her voice trembling.
Please, you have to help me.
I stared at her, my breath caught somewhere between a gasp and a scream. You're not here. This isn't possible."
I don't have much time. They think I just died, but I didn't. I was murdered.
Her words struck me harder than I cared to admit. Murdered? By who? Emily hesitated, her form flickering like a fading light bulb.
It's not what it seems. Look closer. You'll find the truth.
Wait! I reached out instinctively, but she vanished, dissolving into the cold air. For a long moment I stood there in stunned silence. The world seemed to tilt slightly, as though my sense of reality had been wrenched from its foundation. I paced the room, running my hands through my hair as I replayed what I'd just seen. Was I losing my mind? Exhaustion could explain it. The long hours, the pressure of a case that felt eerily familiar. It all had to be catching up with me, but her voice, it echoed in my head, refusing to be dismissed. "Look closer." With shaking hands I reopened her file and studied the autopsy photos again, scrutinizing every detail. My earlier analysis had been thorough, at least I thought it had. But now, with Emily's cryptic warning fresh in my mind, I felt compelled to dig deeper. I started with the soil under her fingernails, a detail I'd dismissed before as insignificant. A closer examination revealed tiny particles of an unusual texture, faintly metallic. I sent a sample to the lab for further analysis and moved on, checking her body for the slightest abnormalities. My eyes lingered on faint impressions around her wrists. At first they'd seemed like the natural creases of her skin, but under magnification, they looked deliberate. Restraints? I documented the new findings meticulously, my thoughts spiraling as I tried to piece together a narrative. The whispers, the ghostly figure. If I could set aside the absurdity of what I'd experienced, there was one undeniable fact. Emily wanted me to see something I'd missed. Hours later, I found myself sitting in front of her police file. The photo of her smiling face stared back at me, her life reduced to a single page of cold facts and a case number. She'd been last seen leaving a gala hosted by her father's political rivals. Witnesses claimed she'd seemed distracted, checking her phone repeatedly before slipping out the back entrance. The next morning, a farmer found her body miles away in a wheat field. The police report was brief, detailing the lack of evidence and the absence of any immediate suspects. But one detail stood out. A text message on her phone sent to an unknown number shortly before her disappearance. It read, "I'm here. Where are you?" The timestamp placed her at the edge of the wheat field minutes before her death. I leaned back in my chair, the pieces swirling in my mind like a puzzle I couldn't quite solve. I didn't know what I believed about ghosts, but Emily's death was no accident. Somewhere in the evidence was the truth she'd begged me to find, and I wasn't going to stop until I found it. The lab results for the soil came back inconclusive, frustrating but not unexpected. All I had so far was a faint metallic sheen in the residue under Emily's nails. It wasn't much to go on. I sank deeper into my chair, staring at the open case file on my desk. Emily's whisper echoed in my mind. "Look closer." It was nearing midnight again, and the quiet hum of the morgue filled the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something critical. Picking myself up, I returned to the examination room, where Emily's belongings were neatly sealed in evidence bags. Her dress was still there, blue satin, torn at the hem, speckled with dirt and faint stains. I'd already examined it for blood or other fluids and come up empty, but now I unfolded it again, this time with her warning guiding my hands. I brought it under a magnifying glass and scanned every inch, brushing my fingers over the fabric. Then I saw it, a single hair, barely visible, clinging to the lining of the dress. The hair was long, dark, and fine, definitely not Emily's. My pulse quickened as I carefully placed it in a sample bag. I wasn't done yet. I turned to her shoes next, wiping away a layer of dirt caked onto the soles. Beneath it, faint but visible, were tiny granules of a glittering substance embedded in the tread. This wasn't ordinary soil, it shimmered in a way I'd never seen before. After hours of meticulous work, I finally sent both the hair and the soil sample to the lab for further analysis. Emily's case was starting to crack open, but what I found next would shatter everything. The results came back 2 days later. The hair wasn't a match for anyone in Emily's family or her close contacts. It belonged to a man. But more importantly, the soil contained traces of rare industrial byproducts. Traces that pointed directly to an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to piece it all together. Why had Emily been anywhere near that site? And more importantly, who had she been meeting there? The answers lay in her connections, and the deeper I dug, the more unsettling the picture became. Emily hadn't been the picture-perfect daughter her father painted her to be. She'd been outspoken, unafraid to challenge the very political system that her family relied on. I found old articles quoting her criticism of her father's associates and their dealings with developers tied to that factory. There was more. Buried in her phone records were text messages to an unidentified number, conversations that grew increasingly tense in tone. One message stood out. "If I go public, they'll destroy me. I need your help." The next night, I returned to the morgue, unable to shake the feeling that I was walking into something much bigger than I'd anticipated. As I sorted through my notes, a chill swept through the room, just like before. I froze, holding my breath, and then I saw her. Emily stood by the examination table, her translucent form flickering like a dying flame.
"You were close."
She said, her voice faint but steady. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice even. Close to what? She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the evidence bags on the counter.
"You have what you need. Just be careful."
"Emily, wait." I took a step toward her, but she faded, her form dissolving into the air. Her warning left a knot in my stomach. The paranoia started the next morning. On my drive to the lab, I noticed a black car in my rearview mirror, tailing me at a steady distance. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just a coincidence. But when the same car appeared later that evening, parked across from my apartment, the unease that had been simmering finally boiled over. I tried to ignore it, throwing myself into my work instead. But it was hard to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every creak in my apartment felt like a threat. Emily's warning echoed in my mind, "Be careful." Despite the fear gnawing at me, I couldn't stop. If anything, it drove me harder. Whoever wanted me to back off didn't realize they'd picked the wrong person to intimidate. I was close to the truth. I could feel it. And I wasn't about to stop now. The evidence was solid, at least I thought it was. But when I handed over the hair sample and the soil analysis to Detective Marshall, his response was frustratingly lukewarm.
This is interesting, but it's not enough to prove foul play.
"What about the soil?" I pressed. "The metallic residue ties her to that abandoned industrial site."
It's circumstantial at best. We need more before we can act on this. Emily Harrington's death is under a magnifying glass because of her father. We can't afford a misstep.
I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to snap. "She was murdered, Sean. This isn't just circumstantial. She's telling me something." He raised an eyebrow.
Telling you like what, in a dream?
I realized my mistake instantly and quickly backpedaled. "What I mean is, the evidence is pointing us somewhere. Can't you at least check out the factory?" He sighed and nodded reluctantly.
I'll send a patrol car to take a look. But, Isabella, don't get ahead of yourself. Let us handle the investigation.
If only it were that simple. The police weren't moving fast enough, and I couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping through my fingers. So I did what I'd always done. I worked. Emily's life was like an intricately woven web, each thread revealing a new secret. In addition to her clashes with her father's allies, I discovered whispers of a romantic relationship she'd kept hidden. Her phone records hinted at frequent calls and messages to someone listed only as D. The deeper I dug, the more questions I uncovered. Who was D? Was this the person she'd been meeting at the industrial site? I was beginning to think I'd struck gold when I returned home late one evening and found my apartment door ajar. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but instead, I crept inside, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The living room was untouched, but when I reached my office, my stomach dropped. My desk was in chaos, papers scattered across the floor. The files on Emily's case, the lab results, her autopsy report, and my personal notes had all been rifled through. My laptop lay open, its screen dark but still powered on. I searched the apartment thoroughly, but nothing else was disturbed, and nothing appeared to be missing. Whoever had been here wasn't interested in my belongings. They were after the case. I locked the door, triple-checked the windows, and sat down to collect myself. That's when the phone rang. The number was blocked. I hesitated before answering, my fingers trembling. Hello? No response, just silence. Who is this? I demanded. Still nothing, but the silence felt purposeful, deliberate. A chill ran down my spine as I hung up, my breaths coming shallow and quick. I barely slept that night, jolting awake at every creak and shadow. By morning I was running on caffeine and adrenaline, the paranoia settling into a dull ache behind my eyes. Back at the morgue I tried to refocus, reviewing Emily's files for the 100th time. That's when the chill came again. I turned slowly, already knowing what I'd see. Emily stood near the examination table, her translucent form flickering weakly. She looked different. Where before she'd seemed composed, now her expression was strained, her form less stable.
You have to stop. They'll come for you.
They already have, I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. But I'm not stopping, not until I know the truth. Her eyes widened in alarm.
You don't understand. They won't stop until you're gone, just like me.
Then help me, I pleaded. Give me something, anything, that can lead me to them. She hesitated, her form flickering again, but finally she nodded.
Derek Stone, he was there that night. He knows what happened.
Who is he? I asked, but Emily was already fading. Her last words hung in the air, barely a whisper.
Be careful, Isabella.
I leaned against the counter, Emily's warning echoing in my mind. Derek Stone. I didn't know who he was yet, but one thing was certain. Whoever had broken into my apartment, and whoever was behind Emily's death, was watching me. The noose was tightening, and I had no choice but to pull the threads tighter until the truth unraveled. Derek Stone. The name rolled around in my mind like a pebble in a shoe, annoying, insistent, and impossible to ignore. I spent hours combing through public records, old news articles, and any scrap of information I could find. It didn't take long to connect him to Gerald Vance, one of the most powerful figures in Emily's father's political circle. Vance wasn't just influential, he was untouchable. His name was attached to major development projects, including the abandoned industrial site. Everything I found painted a picture of a man who thrived in shadows, pulling strings and hiding secrets. Derek Stone, I discovered, was one of Vance's longtime associates, a fixer, the kind of man you called when problems needed to disappear. My stomach turned as I pieced it together. Emily's outspoken criticism of her father's allies, her secret meetings, her final messages. She hadn't stumbled onto something at that factory by accident. She'd been lured there. I didn't wait. I called Detective Marshall, my voice trembling with urgency as I laid out what I'd uncovered. Gerald Vance has his hands all over this, I said. And Derek Stone was the one who likely brought Emily to that factory. Marshall was silent for a moment.
You realize what you're suggesting, Isabella?
I'm not suggesting anything, I snapped. I'm telling you. Look into Vance's dealings at the factory. Talk to Stone. This isn't just some conspiracy theory. Emily's death wasn't random.
All right, I'll open a formal inquiry, but you need to be careful. If Vance is involved, this goes deeper than we thought.
As I drove home that evening, a storm brewed in my chest. The pieces were falling into place, but every step forward felt like stepping closer to the edge of a cliff. I turned onto my street, the familiar sight of my apartment building coming into view. But something felt off. The air seemed heavier, and my heart began to race without reason. Then I saw him. A shadow detached itself from the alley near my building, moving with calculated purpose. Before I could react, the man lunged, yanking my car door open. I caught a glimpse of his face, hardened features, eyes cold as steel, before his hand clamped over my mouth.
Don't scream.
He hissed, dragging me out of the car. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to think. I kicked and twisted, trying to break free, but he was too strong. He shoved me against the car, his grip tightening.
You should have stayed out of this. But now it's too late.
I fought harder, but it felt useless. My vision blurred with tears as terror took hold. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything changed. The air grew icy, a sharp, unnatural chill that made the man shudder. He released me for a moment, looking around in confusion.
What the hell?
He muttered. Behind him, a faint light began to glow. Emily. Her form materialized, more solid than I'd ever seen her, her expression fierce and determined. The man turned, his eyes widening in disbelief.
What are you?
He stammered. Emily didn't answer. Instead, she raised her hand, and the streetlight above us exploded in a shower of sparks. The man stumbled back, his grip on me loosening as he shielded his face. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys and jabbed them into his side, forcing him to release me completely. I ran, my legs shaking but propelled by sheer adrenaline, toward the main road where lights and people would be my salvation. I reached the police station in a blur, bursting through the doors and collapsing against the counter. "He tried to kill me," I gasped. "I know who's behind Emily Harrington's death." Detective Marshall appeared, his face a mix of concern and urgency.
What happened?
I recounted everything, the break-in, the phone calls, the attack. As I spoke, Marshall's expression darkened.
We'll launch an investigation immediately. If Gerald Vance and Derek Stone are involved, we'll find the evidence to bring them down. But Isabella, you're in real danger now. We'll have an officer posted outside your apartment.
That night, I sat alone in the station's safe room, the events replaying in my mind. My body ached and my nerves were frayed, but one thought kept me steady. Emily had saved me. Her ghost had intervened when I needed her most, and I wasn't about to let her down. The police were finally taking action, but I knew this fight wasn't over. Not yet. The next few days passed in a blur of police meetings, witness statements, and cautious relief. The officers didn't mince words when they told me how close I'd come to becoming another victim. But I wasn't scared anymore. I was determined. Detective Marshall led the charge in uncovering Gerald Vance's web of corruption, leveraging the evidence I'd gathered. With the industrial site as a focal point, the investigation exploded. Financial records, phone logs, and a trail of documents revealed the lengths Gerald had gone to hide his crimes. Emily's suspicions had been right. Vance had been embezzling funds from city projects, laundering money through dummy corporations tied to the abandoned factory. When Emily discovered discrepancies in public spending, she confronted him. That was her fatal mistake. It was Derek Stone who arranged the meeting at the factory, under Vance's orders. Emily had likely been coerced or tricked into going. The final piece of the puzzle came when forensics teams scoured the site and found a syringe buried in the dirt, traces of a fast-acting neurotoxin still inside. Emily hadn't died of natural causes or by accident. She'd been silenced. When Gerald was arrested, the city was thrown into chaos. A man once untouchable now faced charges of murder, conspiracy, and a list of white-collar crimes that would take years to sort through. The media swarmed the courthouse, cameras flashing as Gerald and his accomplices were led away in handcuffs. I stood on the sidelines, watching it unfold, with a strange mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. Emily's family, huddled together nearby, wept quietly. I didn't approach them, they deserved their space. But the gratitude in their eyes when they glanced my way was unmistakable. That evening, I returned to the morgue. For the first time in days, I felt calm as I walked into the cold, sterile space where Emily's body still rested. "I think we did it," I whispered, my breath fogging in the chill. The air shifted slightly, and I felt the familiar chill that signaled her presence. Emily appeared, her translucent form glowing softly in the dim light, but this time she looked peaceful.
Thank you.
She said, her voice steady. "I couldn't have done it without you," I replied. "You gave me the courage to push forward." She smiled faintly.
You didn't need me for that, Isabella. You already had it in you.
For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it felt like a quiet understanding. "What happens now?" I asked.
I move on. There's nothing left to keep me here.
A lump rose in my throat. "I'm glad you found justice, Emily. You deserved it."
So did she, your mother.
My breath hitched. "What do you mean?" Emily's expression turned knowing.
You don't need me to tell you. You already know there's more to her story. You just need to look.
The word struck a chord deep within me, stirring memories I'd tried to suppress for years. Emily stepped closer, her form beginning to fade.
Promise me one thing, Isabella. Don't stop searching for the truth. Not for me, not for her, not for anyone.
I nodded, tears welling in my eyes. "I promise." With that, she smiled one last time before dissolving into a shimmer of light. The air warmed slightly, and the oppressive weight I'd felt since the day her body arrived lifted. As I locked up the morgue that night, I couldn't stop thinking about my mother. Emily's case had reopened a door I thought I'd shut for good. Her death had haunted me for most of my life, but now, with everything I'd learned, I realized there might still be answers waiting. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to find them. The days following the arrest of Gerald Vance and his accomplices were filled with both relief and quiet reflection. The city buzzed with the news of the case's resolution, but for me, it was never just about the headline. It was about the lives that were forever altered and the ones I hadn't yet finished uncovering. I found myself sitting in my office at the morgue more often than usual, my thoughts drifting back to Emily. Her ghost had given me the peace I hadn't even realized I'd needed, and yet her words had left a lingering sense of something unfinished. A part of me still couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover, not just for Emily, but for someone else I had loved and lost. It was late one evening when the air shifted again, and I knew, before I even turned around, that Emily was back. I didn't need to look up. I could feel her presence, like a cool breeze that brought clarity in the midst of my thoughts. "Hello, Emily," I whispered softly, my voice barely breaking the silence.
I wasn't sure if I'd ever see you again.
She said, her voice gentle, as though she were speaking from a great distance. I finally turned toward her. Emily was standing by the table where she had once laid, her form more solid than I remembered. But there was no fear, no desperation in her gaze now. There was only peace, a peace I had never seen in her before.
You don't have to worry about me anymore. You did it. You gave me justice.
"I'm glad I could help," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. "You deserved it. I never realized how much of my own pain was tied up in yours. You showed me that even the voiceless deserve a chance." Her eyes softened, and she stepped closer, her presence comforting.
I couldn't have done it without you, Isabella. You're the one who gave me a voice. You reminded me that even the smallest clues matter. You reminded me that there is always a way out of the darkness, if someone is willing to look for it.
A lump formed in my throat. I don't know what I would have done without you, Emily. You helped me when I was too afraid to help myself.
You didn't need me to give you the strength. It was always in you. All I did was show you how to see it.
I swallowed hard, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. I'm sorry you had to go through everything you did. Emily reached out, her hand hovering just above mine.
Don't be sorry. You gave me peace, Isabella, and in turn, you'll find peace too. But you have more work to do. You've only just begun.
What do you mean? I asked, a chill running through me.
There are more people like me. More voices that need to be heard. But I know you will keep listening. And one day, you'll find the answers you've been looking for. For your mother.
My heart skipped a beat at her words. It was like a dam had broken open inside me. I hadn't thought about it like that. My mother's death, the one that had haunted me since childhood, was still unsolved, still a mystery that gnawed at me every night. I had pushed it away for so long, convinced that the answers didn't matter, that they couldn't matter. But now, with Emily's death resolved, I felt something inside me stir. A new resolve. "I will," I said quietly, my voice steady. "I promise." Emily nodded, her smile warm and knowing.
I'm not afraid anymore, Isabella. And I know you won't be afraid either. You've got a purpose, one you can't run from. And you'll find what you're looking for. Not just for me, but for her.
I stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. Emily had shown me a path, one that stretched beyond her death, beyond my fear. It was a path I was ready to walk. "I'll help the voiceless," I murmured. "I'll keep going." Emily's form began to fade, but her smile remained, glowing brightly in the dim light.
Goodbye, Isabella. Keep going. And don't forget, I'll be with you, always.
And just like that, she was gone. The room felt quieter after her departure, but not empty. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the weight of her absence. Instead, I felt the weight of something new, a responsibility, a calling. It wasn't just about finding the answers for Emily anymore. It was about finding the answers for everyone who had been forgotten, everyone whose voice had been silenced. I looked out the window, the city lights glowing softly in the distance. A new day was on the horizon, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was ready to meet it. I stood up from my desk, gathering my notes, and slipped into my coat. As I walked toward the door, I felt a renewed sense of purpose, of direction. The search for the truth had only just begun.